Christian DuPont, and I'm the Burns librarian. And welcome to the John J. Burns Library for Rare Books Special Collections and Archives here at BC, in the room where it actually started. Some of the original collections that just about a century ago are surrounding you in this room. My colleague Marta Creeley, I think, is downstairs. There she's, Marta's okay. So thank you. I certainly want to introduce you as one of our most recent hires here in Burns Library. We're actually a big staff, so people think, that sometimes, because you only see me, sort of running around doing the show here. But so welcome, Marta, and thank you to your staff and to do some of the promotion and engaging with Rachel Young here from Irish Studies to produce these events here. Okay, so that we all very much enjoy together, and that's the wonderful thing. And some of you are here for the first time. I know, because I always look for the places that I don't remember well or know very well as they come in the door. So thank you. And some of you have traveled. We could do one of these things, who traveled the longest distance. Without calling names here, I know that we have farther south than Providence in Rhode Island, and we have people from Cape Cod here, people up on the North Shore. We have students from all abroad, including Australia and other events here. So there we are. So again, thank you for being here, and I hope you are already enjoying the evening, and we're going to enjoy this more with Felix Larkin. And this is a particularly delightful thing. All our events here at Burns Library are really wonderful in collaboration with Irish Studies, but this one has been more than 5 years in the making, literally. So it wasn't the first time we met Felix, but it was a time when we decided, well, you really must come to Boston College, especially because you've known others here and you've made, reacquainted yourself with many of our faculty and meeting some of our students now. But this was in March of 2019 at the American Conference for Irish Studies, an annual meeting which takes place sometimes in Ireland, next year in Limerick. But this one in 2019 was here in Boston. And you came over for that event. You have a niece sort of in the area and always like to visit family, and then come over for these events. And so we were talking at the reception there. Receptions always bring people together, and it was like, we really must have you come and do a talk at Boston College. And then maybe the next day this went by. No, it wasn't, because it actually was very good. We were good. It was 2020, and we were planning 2020, right? So March 2020, March 11, 2020 is when this talk was scheduled. And in fact, I think a few of you, when we were searching things online, actually found the canceled notice or something, because it's still sort of, in the internet, things survive a long time. Yeah, we were shutting down the world then, and we had on that point. Let me to say here, we'll change a couple of slides, but we were so this was even the original poster we had to design, and we were trying to redesign this for updating the date, but. I was getting the calls, and Felix, I'm sending an email, I don't know if you can get on this plane, because they're shutting down the university here, and there's health emergencies, and, it really hit us pretty quickly. And then Felix called me, and they said, yeah, I think you're right, we're hearing the same thing in Ireland. It wasn't so bad in Ireland, right? It was an American problem at that point, right? And we said, okay, I think you really should not get on the plane. And good call, because you wouldn't have gotten back if we had gotten you here, and nobody would have come to this talk. Somebody who brought us together as well, besides that reception at ECIS, is the gentleman right here, my dear friend Anthony Morick. Some of you have met him in this room. I think, if I'm looking at Philip, a dear man, and his wife, Carol, is on the other side of Felix, on that side of the table. But set the scene for us, Felix, right? This is the Martyn Turner room,
this
right?
This is the Martyn Turner room in the Shelburne Hotel in Dublin.
Yeah.
It does a collection of his early cartoons all over the walls, and you can date it because Albert Reynolds is there in the middle as a Taoiseach. Yeah. Early 90s, so.
You can date Ireland by the Taoiseachs. We just had a change of Taoiseach in the last round. Okay.
But that was an occasion when Anthony was honouring Martyn Turner, who is the first person there. The second person is, and I was showing one of his cartoons this evening, is a young cartoonist called Harry Burton, and he draws at the moment for the Examiner newspaper, formerly the Copenhagen Examiner, and he is immensely talented, and I have absolutely no doubt will be Martyn Turner's successor in
And then the foremost critic there, right?
The
Yeah.
last man is Tim Burton, who runs the Cartoon Museum in London and has written several books and brings out an annual of the best cartoons of the year in the British press. And is about to publish a book on Churchill in cartoons. I think it's due out in May. I'm rather annoyed with him because I gave him some Irish cartoons with Churchill in them, which he could have used, and he told me recently that he didn't use any of them.
Now, Felix, this is a recorded talk. I will remind you. Good thing I didn't hand you the microphone. All this, so we're not going to get into the. Very good. You can cattle on it. So, but returning then to Anthony, who brought us together, collector of many things. Irish, actually, Sino-Japanese War, Meiji-era prints, Russo, Jack B. Yeats, of course, were returned to Ireland, but political cartoons of various stripes. And so by the bar in the Irish room where we were downstairs, we had this case all set up for Felix's talk, okay? Now, sadly, Anthony passed away in 2021. So, and I'm very in touch with his wife Carol at tables there. We're still working through the collections, talk about collections and placement of the cartoons. So we weren't able to recreate this display for you this evening, okay? But I wanted to just remember Anthony, again, for helping to bring us together, his magnificent collection. We're going to talk about some of the cartoons here of Grace Gifford. And these are the original ink drawings. I had somebody already exploring. This is the display that we have over here from our collections, which you can take a look at afterward. I'll be very glad to help you look at those. But there we are with Anthony. And so if you enjoyed the reception, this is also for Carol, to thank you to Carol, because Carol has been generous with us here in the library, and we can thank her for the reception this evening and many other things. So thank you. So I won't dedicate this lecture to Anthony, because actually Felix has his own very special dedication. And in fact, there we go. We should start turning now from this longer introduction about how we all got here together to Felix himself. And I love this photo of Felix speaking at the Kennedy Scolio. So, the subtle play of the cartoonist, the halo of the head. So he didn't mind. He allowed me to leave this up here. He knew it was going to come, and I'm not embarrassing him too much here with that wonderful speech. It's a good, there we are, right? All right. So Felix, what to know here? So historian in public service and then historian again, I think. And so educated in Dublin at St. Paul's College, went on to UCD, and then in those years, you might talk about this, I think, in your talk a little bit, right? About 1968, being there as a student in such a formative time, and in history and being aware of that, certainly at the moment, and then going on to the Institute of Public Administration after that for advanced degrees, and then becoming then the public service. So about half the career spent in the Irish Department of Finance, and then subsequently at the National Treasury Management Agency, and obviously some senior positions there. But it's actually his CV since retirement in 2009, after these 35 years in public service, that's even more impressive than his government service. So just to sort of name a few things here. So editorial advisor, external contributor to the Royal Irish Academy's Dictionary of Irish Biography, published by Cambridge in 2009, contributor to each of the 3 volumes of the Edinburgh History of the British and Irish Press, which came out between 20 and 2023. But then, those are contributions to other volumes, but it has his own, and really, you're going to certainly talk about this, the discovery that was actually as a student, right? And the cartoons of Seamus, which may not be a name that you'll know now, but you'll discover this cartoonist thanks to Felix, who literally discovered and preserved that. So we have a book of Felix's dedicated to the Seamus cartoons in the Freeman's Journals from the early 1920s, Terror and Discord. And then we also have, and the title is very fitting for Felix, so because when you get to spend time with Felix, you are truly living with history. And this is a collection of his occasional pieces and longer essays, both in academic journals, talks you've given, pieces in the Irish Times and other public papers, So there's a lot of it here, a lot of story, and this is came out in 2021 here in the last little bit. So from Kingdom Books. So this is a valuable collection. So I'll put that on the table afterward. So in addition to writing, Felix, as that civil servant. I don't know, character. You're devoted to the country and to the service here, and to many organizations, and I admire that in you. I think that I really do. And so again, I'll list some of the interesting and in some ways interconnected, but even very different organizations that Felix has not only been a member of, but has served. So currently treasurer of the Irish Committee of Historical Sciences. This is a very interesting one. As a member of the An Post, the Irish Post Office, Philatelic Advisory Committee. What do you think that committee does? Well, of course, they design stamps and approve stamps. So, and during this period, which you have been chairman as well, over the decade of centenary, so a particularly formative time, and I think now the decade is coming to an end, and maybe you decided, all right, so.
It's over.
Okay, so there are many other organizations that need your talents here. So the National Library of Ireland serving, there's a statutory, by law, Readers Advisory Committee, and you've been twice appointed to that for terms. The Parnell Summer School is another place where you'll find Felix, and that was an academic director for a couple of years in 2013 to 15, as well as the Ivy Day Symposium. Many of you who know Parnell and Joyce will catch the references there, of course. So these are the many commitments. And then, yes, a member of other organizations as well, the National Library of Ireland Society, the Irish Legal History Society, and as a founding member of the newspaper and periodical History Forum of Ireland. And that's really closest to the talk this evening. And so in recognition of your publications, your service in many areas, you were elected, Felix, to the Royal Irish Academy in July of 2022. Why did I stumble on that? I was doing well up until then. I thought, okay, the Royal Historical Society. There we are. Okay, so as a fellow, so this is clearly a sign that I must stop talking at this point and bring Felix to the phone. Okay, so let me do that. All right, please, in welcoming Felix to podium. Thank you, Felix. There we go.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and indeed, thank you to the Burns Library and to Boston College for the invitation and for the great hospitality that you have shown me. Just want to make sure that I know what I'm doing now. I would like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of L.P. Curtis Jr., Perry Curtis, author of the book Apes and Angels, which pioneered the use of cartoons in Irish historical studies. Apologies. He's seen here in Dublin Castle in 2018 at the opening of an exhibition of art from the Great Hunger Museum at Quinnipiac University. Perry was my great and generous mentor when I started work on cartoons some 15 years ago. I begin with this cartoon by the great Martyn Turner in the Irish Times of March 15, 2012. A somewhat gloomy self-portrait, battling the forces of darkness and repeating the mantra, "The pen is mightier than the sword," in an effort to convince himself that this is a tenable proposition. In the article accompanying the cartoon, Turner wrote that most cartoonists actually enjoy the thought that they might be upsetting the odd person through their drawings. He says, "We still see it as our mission to twist a few tails." That's T-A-I-L-S, not T-A-L-E-S. My purpose this afternoon is to show how, in an Irish context, a few tails got twisted in cartoons over the past 240 years. The earliest cartoon I want to speak about, this one, does in fact date back 240 years. One of the very first satirical drawings in Ireland, it appeared in Mathew Carey's Volunteers Journal on April 5th, 1784. Entitled, "Thus Perish All Traitors to Their Country," the victim is John Foster, then the Irish Chancellor of the Exchequer, and later the last Speaker of the Irish Parliament in College Green in Dublin, which is seen in the background. Foster is variously referred to elsewhere in the journal as Jakey Finance and Jack the Bloodsucker. Carey was arraigned for contempt before the House of Commons on account of this cartoon and was jailed in Newgate Prison in Dublin. On his release, he fled to America and had a highly successful career as a publisher in Philadelphia. A plaque marks the location of his print shop in Philadelphia's Market Street. During the first half of the 19th century, Daniel O'Connell, seen here in silhouette, was the focus of innumerable cartoons produced in Dublin and in London, most of them hostile and savagely anti-Catholic. It has been difficult to know which ones to pick for this lecture. The most notable caricaturist of the period was the Catholic Irishman, John Doyle, who, however, plied his trade exclusively in London. As Professor Peter Gray has pointed out, Doyle was, and I quote, preoccupied with Daniel O'Connell, whose career appeared to Doyle to embody a demagogic combination of radicalism, nationalism, and Catholic grievance politics. This is one of Doyle's best cartoons about O'Connell, published in March 1833, and sold as a single sheet, as distinct from a feature in or supplement to a newspaper. It shows him as Gulliver, brandishing a scroll bearing the word repeal, referring to his demand for repeal of the Act of Union of 1800, and being restrained and attacked ineffectively by his political opponents, who are dismissed as Lilliputians. In Swift's Gulliver's Travels, one of the Lilliputians shouts out the phrase, Tolgo phonic, whatever that means in the Lilliputian language, after which all the Lilliputians start firing arrows at Gulliver. In this cartoon, the phrase is attributed to Earl Grey, the British Prime Minister, and the arrows are directed towards the repealed scroll held by O'Connell. The other clearly identifiable Lilliputians include the Chief Secretary for Ireland, Edward Stanley, later the Earl of Derby, and the Lord Lieutenant, the Marquis of Anglesey. (1833). My own favourite cartoon is not by Doyle, but by John Leach, published in Punch in 1845. The title of it is The O'Connell Rent, referring to the subscriptions raised from the public for O'Connell's Repeal Association. The main image shows abject and deferential peasants paying the so-called rent to the great man. It's a pretty crude caricature, unlike the wonderfully whimsical drawings of incidents in O'Connell's life that appear in the borders. The upper border shows the military presence at Clontarf to prevent the monster meeting which O'Connell cancelled at the last minute in 1843. And this is juxtaposed against a police assault on gingerbread stands, presumably hawkers plying for business on the margins of the monster meeting. Thus is the abandoned monster meeting trivialized. The lower border focuses on the trial of O'Connell and others in 1844 for conspiracy against the state. O'Connell is in the dock. The presiding judges are opposite him, and in between there's an incident involving dueling pistols. A not too subtle allusion to the duel in 1815 between O'Connell and John de Stair, in which de Stair was killed. At either end, Robert Peel, the British Prime Minister, and the Duke of Wellington, a leading member of Peel's government, keep an eye on what is going on. Similar items appear in the side borders, and I think these two are the best. King Dan being crowned at the monster meeting held at Tara, and an impish O'Connell in a carriage going to his trial. Of course, as Patrick Geoghegan has written, the result of the trial was rigged from the beginning. And here is a print of a lawyer, the artful dodger, with the devil, old Nick, in the state forge. And they are busy forging evidence of conspiracy for O'Connell's trial. It's a nice pun on the word forge. The Duke of Wellington looks on and proclaims, "This is a better place than Waterloo." This single sheet cartoon was published in Dublin. John Leach, the artist of the O'Connell Rent cartoon, and other Punch cartoonists, notably Henry Furness and John Tenniel, are notorious today for their Simeonization of the Irish. Perry Curtis wrote about, and I quote, "the steady stream of derogatory or denigrating stereotypes emanating from London in the 19th century, mostly vividly expressed by the cartoonists' transformation of militant Irish nationalists, especially Fenians or Republican rebels, into ape-like or bestial creatures." Here are some examples of these cartoons, all by Tenniel. The first dates from 1870, and Tenniel here uses the template of Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, to portray Irish agrarian radicals as the bestial Caliban, armed to the teeth. Gladstone is Prospero, and the staff, which is his instrument of magic, is his land reform bill, then passing through Parliament. And he is shielding his child, not Miranda, but Hibernia, from the frightening advances of Caliban. An unambiguous anti-Catholic sentiment is revealed by the inscription Ultramontane on Caliban's shoulder strap. Tenniel's identification of radical Irish nationalists with Caliban is even more explicit in this cartoon, referring to the testimonial of nearly £40,000, which was paid to Parnell by the Land League in 1883. Parnell is shown gratefully accepting the money from O'Caliban, and acknowledging his debt to him, thereby, in Tennille's eyes, compromising himself as a political leader. Undoubtedly, the worst of Tennille's Irish cartoons is his Irish Frankenstein, which appeared in Punch shortly after the Phoenix Park murders in 1882, the knifing to death of Lord Frederick Cavendish, Chief Secretary for Ireland, and his principal civil servant, Thomas Burke, a loathsome crime which shocked British public opinion and which must have seemed to confirm these images of the Irish as monsters in the cartoons of Tennille and his two most notable colleagues on Punch, John Leach and Henry Furness. Curiously, both Leach and Furness had strong Irish connections. Leach was of Irish extraction, and Furness was born in Wexford, albeit of English parents, and had begun his career with the Irish satirical magazine Zosimus. There were many satirical magazines in Dublin in the late 19th century, but none had as much impact or lasting significance as the cartoons published by the Weekly Freeman's Journal beginning in 1880. Introducing a satirical note into the mass circulation press in Ireland for the very first time, these cartoons were distributed gratis as supplements with the newspaper. They addressed political themes with great immediacy, and the fact that they were in colour added to their appeal. They were duly copied by other Irish newspapers, such as United Ireland and the Weekly Irish Times. These cartoons were a uniquely Irish phenomenon. There is no exact parallel in the British press. The three artists mainly responsible for them were John D. Ray, Thomas Fitzpatrick, and John Fergus O'Hee. O'Hee's cartoon, What Villains Have Done This, published by the Freeman in response to the Phoenix Park murders, is in stark contrast to Tennille's Irish Frankenstein and features the female figure of Erin. Perry Curtis observed that although the iconic figure of Erin or Hibernia has a long history, the golden age of graphic images of this beautiful, young, and virtuous epitome of Ireland really belongs to the last third of the 19th century, unquote. Erin, the female figure, appears in about 1/3 of the cartoons published by the Weekly Freeman and United Ireland. The cartoons in the Weekly Freeman and United Ireland document the land war of the 1880s and are often reproduced in studies of that period. This one from the Weekly Freeman in July 1881 is, I think, particularly special, since it refers to the Ladies' Land League, a neglected part of the story of the land war. The Ladies' Land League was founded by Anna Purnell in January 1881, and some members were, like the men of the parent Land League, subject to prosecution. This cartoon is a scene from Kilmallock Petty Sessions, where the presiding resident magistrate was a Major Clifford Lloyd, hence the title of the cartoon, Justice Unalloyed. Gladstone's Land Act of 1881 was an attempt to address some of the concerns of the Land League. It gave power to civil bill courts to fix rents, termed judicial rents, with provision for referral to a land commission to appeal the judicial rents. This legislation was seen as creating endless possibilities for legal wrangling, a cash cow for lawyers. Accordingly, in January 1882, the satirical magazine Pat looked into the future with this vision of Ireland 100 years later, with the lawyers so rich that they have displaced the old landlords as proprietors of the land and are now sitting comfortably on their rents. The Atlantic Ocean has become the Atlantic Ocean. St. George's Channel, the Gorge on Us Channel, and Ireland is Direland. Many of you will be familiar with Professor Margaret Kelleher's magnificent book about the Mamtrasna murders in 1882. We now know that there was a miscarriage of justice in this case, and that a man, Miles Joyce, was wrongly hanged, and several others wrongly imprisoned for long terms. But their innocence was, in fact, widely accepted at the time, and there were accordingly many claims for a review of the case. Claims that were resisted by Dublin Castle under the Lord Lieutenant Earl Spencer, known as the Red Earl because of his enormous red beard. Spencer, ignoring the proofs of innocence of the condemned men, is the subject of this powerful cartoon in the Weekly Freeman. Two of the artists responsible for these wonderful cartoons, Thomas Fitzpatrick and John Fergus O'Hee, later collaborated on a monthly satirical magazine called The Leprechaun, published in Dublin between 1905 and 1915. By then, however, their style of cartooning had become dated. A more subtle and crisper kind of cartoon was appearing in London newspapers such as the Daily Mail and Daily Mirror, a byproduct of the so-called Northcliffe Revolution, which created the modern populist press. This new form of cartooning came to Ireland with the recruitment of an Englishman, Ernest Forbes, to the staff of the Freeman's Journal in 1920. Using the pseudonym Seamus, he was the first regular cartoonist on an Irish daily newspaper. His cartoons during the Irish War of Independence and Civil War were daring and hard-hitting. Up to the truce of July 1921, their main target was the increasingly brutal nature of British rule in Ireland, while afterwards they attacked the new government of Northern Ireland and the Republican opposition to the Anglo-Irish Treaty signed in December 1922. I have written a short book about the Seamus cartoons, so again, it is difficult for me to pick some to share with you today. This one, however, is my favorite. For quite apart from the force of its message, it is a most accomplished and skillful drawing. It's entitled No Uncertain Voice. And I like that title because it aptly describes the work of most cartoonists. Generally speaking, theirs is no uncertain voice. This cartoon appeared in the Freeman on April 26, 1922, shortly after the occupation of the Four Courts in Dublin by armed anti-treatyites, the prelude to the outbreak of the Civil War. Its unambiguous message is that armed resistance to the treaty, symbolized by the skillfully drawn gunmen in the foreground, that flouts majority opinion in Ireland. The building in the background is the Bank of Ireland in College Green, the seat of the last Irish Parliament before the Act of Union of 1800. The caption as published has one of the gunmen asking, "What's all the noise?" To which the other replies, "Don't worry, it's only the voice of the unarmed people." And the unarmed people can be seen in the bottom left-hand corner, and their uncertain voice is being ignored by the gunmen. This Seamus cartoon was published on the occasion of the death of Michael Collins. It shows the female figure of Ireland, the iconic Erin, and she is prostrate with grief. A Freudian slip by an old man, forgive me. And she is prostrate with grief at Collins's death. The broken column is a traditional symbol of a life cut short, and each column in the cartoon bears the name of an Irish leader whose aims were not realized because of his untimely death. Collins is the latest in a line that includes Arthur Griffith, Charles Stewart Parnell, Daniel O'Connell, and others. Their unbroken columns mark out Ireland's Via Dolorosa, which is the title of the cartoon. It is probably the Seamus cartoon that most resonates with us today. I find that people always respond strongly to it, a tribute to the continuing cult of Michael Collins. Collins also features in this cartoon by David Lowe. He is dancing with Lloyd George in front of a gravestone that reads, "Here lies the Irish trouble, aged about 800 years." Titled the Joy Jig Jazz, it was published in the London Evening Star newspaper on December the 8th, 1921, 2 days after the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. It celebrates what Lowe assumed, or maybe just hoped, was the end of the centuries-long conflict between Britain and Ireland. But there are other important elements in it. It records Unionists' satisfaction with the fact that the treaty confirms their exclusion from what would become the Irish Free State. At the top of the cartoon, there is a disembodied person, identified as possibly Sir James Craig, the Premier of Northern Ireland, or alternatively the editor of the Belfast newspaper, the Northern Whig, a Unionist organ. Whoever he is playing God Save Our Gracious King on a concertina. Is this the tune that Lloyd George and Michael Collins are dancing to? And if so, what is the significance of that? Is it a not too subtle allusion to the acceptance by Collins and his colleagues of the Crown as part of the new constitutional framework for Ireland under the treaty? But not everyone is happy. At the bottom left-hand, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. At the bottom left-hand corner, we see two disgusted diehards, Southern Irish Protestants, and we are told that their occupation is gone. And this presumably refers to their occupation of the south of Ireland rather than to their jobs or professions. And they are said to be about to flee the country. Finally, Lowe inserts a self-portrait into this cartoon at the bottom on the right-hand side. And he is shown as very busy today, burning all the excellent cartoons he would have published if they hadn't made peace. Lowe clearly anticipates that with the advent of peace, there will be no further opportunity for such cartoons in the British press. But, as I discuss later, he wasn't quite right about that. Excuse me. In 1921, when this cartoon was published, David Lowe was aged 30, And having arrived in London from Australia 2 years earlier, he was embarking on a career that would establish his reputation as the greatest cartoonist of the interwar years in Britain. This cartoon presents a sympathetic view of the Irish, unusual in the British press, and quite unlike that of Leach or Tennille. Lowe, as a fellow colonial, did not demonize the Irish. And note that Lowe's discarded cartoons, those that he is burning, include one entitled Black and Tan and Jackboot, thereby suggesting disapproval of British policy in Ireland in the period leading up to the treaty. During the civil war that followed the treaty, the Republican publicity effort in Ireland was strengthened by the services of two women cartoonists, Constance Markievicz and Grace Gifford, widow of the 1916 leader Joseph Mary Plunkett. Their cartoons were important because the very few and rather amateur print outlets available to the Republicans didn't have the capacity to include photographs, and cartoons were a tolerable substitute. Gifford was particularly talented, an artist and cartoonist of considerable ability. There was always a delightful, whimsical quality in her work, even in her political cartoons, which were necessarily propagandistic. A good example of her work during the Civil War is this cartoon, which shows Michael Collins as a circus ringmaster introducing a dog to perform some tricks. The dog is identified as Ireland a Province, and it is carrying a Union Jack flag and balancing an oath of allegiance on its nose. At the ringside is a dissolute King George V, accompanied by representatives of a supposedly happy empire, rather crudely caricatured as primitive tribesmen. The subliminal message is that the Anglo-Irish Treaty implies an equivalence between such tribesmen, lesser mortals, and the Irish people. Isabella MacNee is the only other Irish woman cartoonist of any real distinction. A selection of her caricatures of members of the first government of the Irish Free State was published in 1925 as The Celebrity Zoo, under her pen name, Mac. This is her portrait of Patrick McGilligan, Minister for Industry and Commerce, who was responsible for the Shannon hydroelectric scheme. And the portrait is accompanied by a verse which includes the following: "This fish, with guile to make you shiver, wants to harness the Shannon River." She was most unkind to Hugh Kennedy, Attorney General from 1922 to 24, and later Ireland's first Chief Justice. A heavy man, she drew him as a hippopotamus. The verse which goes with this caricature reads, "Look, for the graceful hippo comes in view. His feet are huge, but not so huge as Hugh, who, as a foremost figure of the state, finds he and his opinion carry weight." In March 1922, as Ireland drifted towards civil war, two young men, Arthur Booth and Charles E. Kelly, both Dubliners and both gifted cartoonists, launched Dublin Opinion, Ireland's most celebrated satirical magazine, a monthly miscellany of cartoons and other humorous features. They were later joined by Tom Collins, another Dubliner, as the principal writer. The journal was modelled on a similar British magazine, London Opinion, published between 1903 and 1954. The first issue of Dublin Opinion, March 1922, sold out. and that was the start of a successful run that went on until 1968. Its light tone at the time of great political upheaval in Ireland seemed to catch the public imagination. It claimed not to have any politics, but instead to be on the side of the people and generally against whatever government was in power. Its policy was to give only kindly criticism, which meant that, as Kelly wrote, we made no enemies and our victims became our friends. It did not, however, always exercise such restraint, as when, in March 1925, it published a cover cartoon of Eamon de Valera, the leader of the Republican faction recently defeated in the Civil War, standing so tall that his head pushes the top border of the cartoon upwards and distorts the legend above it. The caption is "High Treason." Kelly and Collins became joint editors of Dublin Opinion in 1926 after the premature death of Arthur Booth, the first editor. Both were employed as civil servants in Dublin and edited the magazine in their spare time. The character of Dublin Opinion was defined by the culture of the civil service, and indeed it was a perceptive critic of the civil service. For example, Kelly drew a series of whimsical cartoons depicting individual departments and offices, imputing to each a host of imagined absurdities. For example, this cartoon about the Department of Finance spread over 2 pages. Here are 2 details from the cartoon. The first shows an official confiscating, for the common good of course, some children's savings, while the second features the drain for putting the people's money down. Another series illustrated certain stock phrases that Irish civil servants use in correspondence. A cartoon in this series, entitled "The Department Regrets," shows an office full of middle-aged men weeping copiously. Probably Dublin Opinion's finest hour was in 1959, when it stoutly defended the proportional representation voting system, PR, which De Valera and his Fianna Fáil government sought to abolish shamelessly for electoral advantage. 2 of the cartoons at that time were brilliantly incisive. The first, capitalizing on De Valera's reputation as a mathematical genius, has him standing at Broombridge in Dublin, associated with Rowan Hamilton's discovery of the formula for quaternion multiplication, and chalking up on the side of the bridge the formula FF, Fianna Fáil, minus PR equals FF to the power of N. The second shows a schoolroom with 3 boys of different heights at a blackboard on which their teacher has drawn 3 apples. And the teacher explains, under PR, each boy gets an apple. Under the straight vote, the biggest boy gets the lot. The referendum necessary to abolish PR was lost by a narrow margin, and Dublin Opinion's campaign was widely credited with having had a critical influence on the outcome. It was, of course, unusual for serving civil servants to be so openly associated with a publication like Dublin Opinion, and this sometimes did give rise to controversy. The editor's dual roles were tolerated, most probably because Irish politicians were as amused as everyone else by the fare on offer in Dublin Opinion, and they recognized its value in reducing the tensions in Irish public life after the Civil War. Sean T. O'Kelly, Ireland's second president, once praised it for, and I quote, pouring the balm of laughter on our wounds. And his words are significant, for despite the predominantly anti-establishment tone of satirical cartoons, their effect may be less to undermine the establishment than to prop it up by channeling discontent into laughter and making the powerful seem less of a threat by ridiculing them. Thus, the editors of Dublin Opinion claimed that humour is the safety valve of a nation, and a nation which has its values right will always be able to laugh at itself. Dublin Opinion virtually monopolised cartooning in Ireland during its years of publication. When the Freeman's Journal went out of business in 1924, Ernest Forbes returned to England, and except for the work of Gordon Brewster in the Evening Herald and Sunday Independent, and of Victor Brown in the early years of the Irish press, the satirical cartoon was thereafter largely absent from Irish newspapers until the 1970s. Brewster's cartoons mostly eschewed Irish politics, focusing instead on lifestyle and socio-economic matters. Brown, like Forbes, was English, and his cartoons under the signature B, B-E-E, were largely political. Since the press was the party organ of Fianna Fáil, they were blatantly partisan. His most provocative cartoon was his very first one, published in the inaugural issue of the Irish Press on September 5th, 1931. It shows a line of men and a woman in chains en route to the guillotine. And the first two have been dubbed Old Order and Social Pretension, respectively. Their fate, as foreshadowed here, is absurd fantasy, and therein lies the humour, the dark humour of the cartoon. Beneath the fun, however, there is a serious message. The remnants of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy and the so-called Castle Catholics and all others who do not subscribe to Fianna Fáil's version of Irishness will find themselves in trouble when Fianna Fáil and De Valera come to power. That there will be no place for them in De Valera's Ireland is signalled by the caption on the cartoon, which, slightly misquoting the Lord High Executioner's song in Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado, reads, "We've got them on the list, and they'll none of them be missed." Meanwhile, as anticipated by David Lowe in his cartoon marking the Anglo-Irish Treaty, British cartoonists after 1921 largely ignored Ireland and the Irish, but only until the Troubles in Northern Ireland broke out in the late 1960s, and the IRA extended its campaign of violence to London and other parts of Britain. Some British cartoonists, especially in the tabloid press, responded to the Troubles by resurrecting and repackaging the image of the Simian Irish from the pages of Punch a century earlier. Unlike in the Victorian era, such anti-Irish stereotypes now embraced the Protestant as well as the Catholic Irish. Thus, Raymond Jackson, Jack, published a cartoon in the Evening Standard in 1982 depicting a spoof film poster for the ultimate in psychopathic horror, the Irish, with terrorists on both sides of the Troubles depicted as equally misshapen monsters, comparable to those in the Punch cartoons. Occasionally, however, British cartoons displayed a more sophisticated perspective on the Troubles. One such is Nicola Jennings' Harp and Guns, in which the strings of the symbolic Irish harp are replaced with guns, and the shadow of a gunman heaves into view, a genuflection towards Sean O'Casey's play of that name. Instead of the usual figure of a winged maiden on the Irish harp, there is a dove. Acknowledgement of an aspiration to peace, despite the violence endemic in Ireland. I love this cartoon. It says so much, so simply. Brexit has given rise to a further negative Irish stereotyping in British cartoons. The most controversial instance of this was Christian Adams' cartoon in the London Evening Standard of July 2nd, 2019, which showed the last surviving candidates then contesting for the leadership of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, as leprechauns, chasing a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. It refers light-heartedly to the very real difficulty which the incoming leader would face in reconciling British withdrawal from the European Union with the need to avoid the return of a hard border on the island of Ireland. But a leprechaun trope in a cartoon about an issue pertaining to Ireland, even if British politicians were the target, was undoubtedly insensitive and was generally regarded as such. In Northern Ireland during the Troubles, when mayhem, violence, and death were everyday facts of life, much more was at stake in addressing issues in a cartoon than elsewhere. The imperative, at least for the mainstream press there, was to avoid heightening sectarian tensions. Ian Knox's cartoon for the Irish News, the main nationalist newspaper in Northern Ireland, about the car bomb attack by an IRA splinter group in Omagh, County Fermanagh, which killed 29 people and injured over 200 on a Saturday afternoon in August 1998, is a good example of how a cartoonist can convey outrage at an atrocity with tact and good taste. It shows the coffins of those who died that day being carried off in one direction, while another coffin, marked violent republicanism, is brought in the opposite direction, towards the metaphorical grave that Republicans have dug for themselves by their actions. On the question of whether cartoons on such sensitive topics are appropriate, Knox has said, and I quote, "I never shrank from any issue. If you've got it right, even if it's horrible, the victims don't object." Another example of a cartoon in response to an atrocity in Northern Ireland that got it just right is this one by the very talented young Dublin-based cartoonist Harry Burton. It refers to the shooting dead of the journalist Lyra McKee by Republicans during a riot in Derry in April 2019. The words quoted in the cartoon are taken from an open letter to herself that McKee wrote and published in 2014, when she was aged just 24. Words about her hope for the future that she was so tragically denied by continuing Republican violence. After Dublin Opinion ceased publication in 1968, there was sadly no successor magazine in Ireland. But the vacuum was filled when Martyn Turner was employed by the Irish Times as its first full-time cartoonist in 1976. In the words of Professor Terence Brown, his politically acute cartoons add to the newspaper's reputation for sharply expressed and hard-hitting commentary. This is particularly true of his contributions on what might be called the the liberal agenda in Ireland. A fine example of his work in this vein is a cartoon published after the defeat of a proposal to lift a constitutional ban on divorce in Ireland in 1986. Those who had resisted the change are compared to the obdurate Orange Order in Northern Ireland, with their propensity to say no to every reform. The banner incorporates a portrait of De Valera clutching his constitution in place of King Billy, the Protestant hero William of Orange, and the exhortation is to remember 1937, the year of the adoption of Dev's constitution, instead of 1690, the year of the Battle of the Boyne. Without question, Turner's greatest cartoon today is that published on the front page of the Irish Times, itself an unusual occurrence, on February 17th, 1992, about the Irish government's efforts to prevent a pregnant 14-year-old girl from travelling to England for an abortion. As you know, until 2018, there was a constitutional ban on abortion in Ireland. The cartoon linked the young girl's predicament with internment without trial, introduced in Northern Ireland in the 1970s. The depiction of the girl with her hair in a pigtail and carrying a teddy bear, standing on a map of Ireland, surrounded by a razor wire-topped fence, left an indelible mark on the public discourse in Ireland on the abortion issue. Sometimes satire does matter. It can do much more than make us laugh, and this is an example of that. More recently, in 2012, in response to the collapse of confidence in so many pillars of Irish society, Turner offered this little gem. Each of the four figures here, politician, priest, banker, and doctor, asks us to trust me, despite the fact that each one represents a discredited part of the Irish establishment. But note the little guy in the bottom right-hand corner. He is a regular feature in Turner's cartoons, a sort of Greek chorus. And in this instance, he tells us, a few more tribunals would sort the country out. Trust me, I'm a lawyer. But perhaps what we really need now to sort out my country, and indeed yours, is a few more cartoonists to twist a few tales. But sadly, cartoonists are now being dropped from many newspapers, even the august New York Times and the ultra-liberal Guardian in London. This is the sad note on which I must end this lecture. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for adding the term simionization to my vocabulary. I was not previously familiar with it. And then I wanted to ask you I don't know if this is correct, but my understanding is that the Irish had some sympathy to the Germans in both of the world wars, and so I'm wondering if, since there was a lot of simionization of the Hun, especially during World War I, if there were any parallels or any doubling of that in Irish caricature, if anyone ever commented on that in your particular realm of experience. So.
Well, firstly, I'd say there was no sympathy with Germans, neither the First or Second World War. That's a Republican myth. In the Second World War, there was very severe censorship, and the purpose of the censorship was to make sure that neither side was favoured or criticised. I mean, either the Allies or the Axis. So that it was almost not commented upon rather than commented. And as I pointed out, cartoons were not a daily feature of newspapers at that stage. I don't know what's happened to our feed, but anyhow.
Felix, I really enjoyed that. Not sure if I share your conclusion that the age of satirical cartoon is over. Things evolve, things change. The Guardian, you gave an example of cutting down on cartoonists, but they've got Tom Bolt, who's doing incredible work in satirizing academics and literary people in a remarkable way. But my question is different. Very impressed by the presentation, how we can follow Irish history in a way through cartoons, right? And often what I find is when historians engage in cartoons, we use it to illustrate our talks, we use it to illustrate our classes, we need PowerPoint, and we all use PowerPoint, we all bring cartoons. Historians, literary scholars, I believe, definitely in Boston College, but in any place, we're using cartoons all the time. What I'm wondering is, if we take cartoons seriously, as you do they just illustrate and demonstrate what we already know about history, accentuate it, or can they tell us a different history? If we decide to study cartoons, history through cartoons, can we come with a different narrative from the one that we have? Does it just enforce what we know and it's there just as illustrations, or can it tell us other ways of understanding the past?
I suppose the answer to that is that it is one route into the past, in the same way as reading editorials in newspapers. The text gives you a particular angle, so the cartoons give you an angle as well. At the end of the day, the cartoons are the creation of one person, and while certainly in the 19th century, indeed for the first half of the 20th century, there is considerable evidence that the cartoons were tailored to the editorial policy of the newspaper. Certainly the Seamus cartoons, which I have studied in depth, it is perfectly clear from the marginalia on the cartoons that he was coordinating his cartoons with the editorial writers in the paper. And I think that was probably standard practice in most papers at that time. So it is really complementing the editorial stance taken by papers, which in turn complements the politics that the paper was espousing. Just your opening comment in taking issue with my reference to the Guardian, what I'm talking about are political cartoons, and political cartoons are now becoming too hot for any newspaper to take. So, you had, in the case of the Guardian in the last year, Steve Bell, who was undoubtedly the roughest but also most talented cartoonist in Britain at the moment, he was dropped from the Guardian, and the New York Times dropped their cartoons in 2019. And there was always a tradition in Britain, and I presume in America, I don't know as much about that, about cartoons on socio-economic matters. They continue, but the political cartoon is definitely in decline. The political cartoon is what I've been talking about.
So if I'm an artist or a cartoonist in either the UK or in London or in any part of Ireland or maybe in Scotland, how easy is it for me to see Gilray and Hogarth? How much exchange of visuals is there?
The answer to that is that there are many, many instances of cartoonists harking back to previous well-recognized cartoon images. So cartoonists do tend to look at the tradition and build on it. I didn't explore that in this kind of lecture because I was doing an overview, but you will often see, for example, there've been a number of cartoons over the years about the Middle East and Israel and whatever, which hark back to earlier images, and they will be stated to be perhaps with apologies to Gilray or whoever. There's can I remember the details? There's one very influential British cartoonist who wrote, I can't remember the name, but he drew a cartoon at the end of the Second World War, where he basically, when the election was taking place in Area 45, basically exhorting the electorate not to squander the peace. It was seen as very influential in the Labour victory in 1945, and that image does recur again and again in cartoons at election time. So yes, the good cartoonists are conscious of the tradition and often acknowledge it explicitly, yes. But they're also very inventive people, and they create their own images. So you get a bit of both. If you were a young cartoonist starting now, your problem would be getting employment.
I think we'll do just one more before we return to some informal conversation around some cartoons here, if we may. So, Michael, may I go to one of our students?
Thank you. Thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it.
Great, thank you.
I was kind of thinking about you speak a lot about the political ends of Irish cartoons and the political value that they have. So I was kind of wondering about the involvement of, or like depictions of black and brown bodies in them, if it exists, and if you could speak more to that.
Doesn't exist in Irish cartoons, I'm afraid. It may well do in the future now, because we have a very high level of asylum seekers coming to Ireland from various parts of the world. It's a difficult issue for us because we have a housing crisis for our own population, never mind for asylum seekers. But no, it doesn't. I can't point to anything in Irish cartoons that would address the issue that you are referring to. But it's a fair. I did see, and it was fascinating actually. Some years ago, I love Snoopy. I know he's not a political cartoonist, but very, very, very subtle stuff. And there was a great exhibition of Schultz's work in London some years ago, and one of the items on display, or one of the sections, referred to a kid writing to with Schultz and saying, "All your characters are white. Can you introduce a black child or a black character?" And he does. And I can't give you a chapter and a verse on it now, but it does address your issue because, obviously in that, as in so many other things, it's a theme that is neglected, yes. Of course. You know that better than I do.
So we can continue a bit of conversation. We do have some cartoons out, and we even have Felix's books. These are from our Burns collection, so I put them out, turn pages carefully if you will. This is The Terror and Discord, and there's a tradition of maybe giving speakers gifts, a speaker's gifts, but in this case we have a speaker's gift on the table. So as we were corresponding about this and looking at the Seamus cartoons, you challenged us to say, do we have a copy then of Seamus's cartoons from the Freeman's Journal? And sure enough, we didn't. And sure enough, this man just gave us one. So we have, here we are. This is actually a rather rare book, so we're rather pleased for this. And I'll ask you to leave. I'll be around and I can help you look at a few things here. This has a frayed dust jacket here because it is rare, but it is signed by Forbes. So that's what even makes it more special, this particular copy here. And then all right. You have your Grace Gifford. You have several illustrations that Felix even picked out from our many. We really have the full run.
You have a fantastic collection.
So,
yeah, I had great fun.
Please come back to Burns Library and look at our collection.
No, I had great fun exploring it with you yesterday. Yes, the Seamus cartoon book is rare, but it's not actually terribly valuable because nobody knows anything about him except me.
So you've raised the market value.
So there's actually no market. But
well, I was trying to buy one of this and I couldn't find one immediately.
Well, you know, it is rare. It is rare, but that doesn't make it a value. I would know nothing about Seamus, but for the fact that when I was researching, like my main academic interest is the history of newspapers and the Freeman's Journal in particular. And when I was a graduate student many, many, many years ago, I got to know the daughter of the last owner of the Freeman's Journal, and she told me who the cartoon. Obviously, all I knew was Seamus. She told me who he was, so I had the name. I knew nothing other than the name and that he was an Englishman. And then in 2005, a box of 300 of his original drawings came on the market in White's in Dublin. They didn't know what they had. I was probably the only man alive who knew what they had, and I persuaded the National Library to buy them, and I got first use of them, hence the book, as my little reward. But because I had the name, I was then able, and I had the reason to do it. I was able to go and research him and find out something about him, and so I did resurrect him.
Hence the value of history and the historian.
Yeah,
and
indeed.
Trust me, I'm a librarian, so I can say that. There we are. Okay, thank you again, Felix, and we'll adjourn. Okay?